Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I have a very interesting guest that I'm very excited about having on. Now, a few years ago, now it's almost been 3 years, it'll be 3 years in a little bit, that I was on, 3 years, my goodness, on Mormon Stories. And in one of the, I gave my story about how I became an atheist for like 13 years. And actually, one of the most important things that ever happened to me was I encountered this very volume at a bookstore in the early aughts. Now, the book is called Josh McDowell's the author, and is the new evidence that demands a verdict. He had originally written a book called The Evidence That demands a verdict back in the 70s or 80s, I believe, and this was an updated volume. So, just to give you a little biographical sketch here on my journey, um, I hadn't really studied Christian apologetics. I just assumed there were these great apologists who are making these great arguments. They're defeating atheists at college campuses during debates, and they were defending the faith. And I thought, Paul tells us we need to have a ready answer. And I was like, I need to start studying apologetics. And I opened up this book, and almost immediately I was like, oh, Houston, we done got a problem here. Because I recognized almost immediately that this type of apologetics that Josh McDowell was putting out was actually not there to defend the faith amongst the heathen or the world, but was actually to keep people in the Christian faith. And once I recognized that was the tactic, I recognized that Christian apologetics was probably not going to be something that was going to work for me. And my guest here, Ryan Wimmer, is an individual who's had a history studying Josh McDowell, has actually given some presentations at Sunstone about it, and has also engaged other Christian apologists on this topic. Ryan, unmute yourself and welcome to the program.
Hi, glad to be here.
So Ryan, before we delve into Josh McDowell, and by the way, he's actually got some slides that he's going to share with the audience. It's going to be kind of a pared down version of what he gave at Sunstone last year. Now it's last year, unbelievable. We're in the new year now. And but before we do that, Ryan, just give a little background on your faith journey and tell people a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I grew up here in the Salt Lake area. Um, yeah, I grew up, a member of the LDS Church, but I had a dad who was a little more, he was a little more born again Christian. He had converted from being a Pentecostal, and so he was just very different in his approach.
Okay.
He watched Billy Graham more than he watched General Conference.
Okay.
Because Billy Graham kind of gave him more what he wants to hear.
Okay.
And so I served a mission, probably around it was to August 2003. I kind of lost faith in everything, and but I kept going until 2010. And actually, I had my name removed from records of the church. I actually regret doing that. Uh,
Okay.
I wish I
What,
could take that back.
why
But
why so? Why do you regret it?
well, I mean, the reality is I don't believe in it, but I still like my Mormon heritage. I had a 17-year-old son just baptized a week ago, and so I've been going to church a little bit with him, and I like being part of it here and there, and so I was actually looking at the game being rebaptized some time back, but I just couldn't make it through the interview questions. So you know, we'll see what happens in the future.
Okay, interesting, interesting. And so it's also fascinating that your father is a convert. I didn't know that, who had came from a Pentecostal background. And of course, is probably very influenced by the evangelical Pentecostal world that he grew up in, of course, still watching Billy Graham. And that's what was so interesting to me is that your father actually was a big fan of Josh McDowell and his apologetics work. Now, I'll have you know that I actually heard Josh McDowell speak at a youth conference in the 80s when I was a young kid and kind of grew up with him being like the premier Christian apologists. He was on all the different TV programs, so he's very, very well known. And but like I never read his stuff just because I thought, well, we got all the answers, we got the Bible, and we got this, and everything's all set. It's all good. And so you kind of had a similar thing with your father. Your father was a really big fan of Josh's.
Yeah, so uh I don't know when I first heard the name Josh McDowell, but I just know through teenage years, my dad emphasized a lot, that Christianity has been proven, that there's more proof that Jesus lived and was died and was resurrected than Alexander the Great or and all this. And so I kind of grew up with this thought of, yeah, I mean, this stuff is concrete. And if you want to know the truth, I really think that's, and my dad probably won't ever watch this, but I'm not blaming my dad for anything here, but that reliance on physical actual evidence was a bigger deal to me than ever the pray about it, get the spiritual experience. And so when that stuff started to unravel for me, that's kind of what led me down the path of, I don't want to say apostasy, that might be the wrong word, but of just losing belief. Because, well, whilst I was on my mission, I bought some Josh McDowell books,
Okay.
and the evidence that man's a verdict at the time was extremely boring to me. I couldn't make it through that. But I bought another one by him called Answers. That one I read, and I just wasn't as impressed, as my dad had been.
Okay.
Um, and so I kind of started losing confidence in Christian apologetics. So I turned, apologetics. I thought they had it.
Mhm.
And then I kind of lost confidence in that. And
So what kind of a
yeah,
more what kind of Mormon apologetics were you looking at?
the farms,
Hmm.
I thought they were the bomb. They had it. I loved them. And actually, in some ways, I kind of miss them, being around because I was a fan of them during their high peak of publishing, and so I got a whole bunch of their stuff still. And so, yeah, I thought they had it all figured out.
So are you saying that you were more impressed with the material that Mormon apologists were putting out as opposed to Christian apologists or other?
Yes, I was, and some of that could come up during this presentation.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, because see, when people talk about the Bible versus the Book of Mormon, I from a very early beginning saw that that's not a very good comparison because the Bible, no one argues that didn't come from the ancient world. So of course it talks about real people and real places here and there. So when people are saying, "Oh, we know this was here and this was here," I'm like, "Well, okay, the Doctrine and Covenants mentions real places, but what does that mean?" And so, whereas if there was actual evidence for the Book of Mormon, then you do have an argument, how would Joseph Smith known this, this, and this?
Hmm.
So, and I thought Farms was presenting that. And so, yeah, I was much more impressed by Mormon apologetics and Christian apologetics because Christian apologetics seemed a little more hollow to me than because, yeah, if you can prove the Book of Mormon, yeah, Joseph Smith really had tapped into something.
So for you, Mormonism did more to prove Christianity as being true than what Christian apologists were saying.
Oh, absolutely. The last thing I clinged to was the site of Nahum that, they claim that they have found. That was I had pinned everything on that because lots of other things just started crumbling, and yeah, eventually that fell too. But
Okay,
it's
so
still to this day, that's more impressive than anything Christian apologists have come up with for
I
me.
I can see that the NHM is a as close to a bullseye as one could get in many ways. Yeah, I don't. I think it's the strongest argument for the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and I I'm fascinated by the different competing, geography models of the Book of Mormon. That's because, I've got a lot of friends in the Heartland camp. Of course, I got plenty of Mesoamerican people too. And I know that like I've had Thomas Murphy on my show a few times, and he actually kind of did a breakdown of the Heartland model. He says, yes, I'm a Heartlander as well, but he says I believe that these events happened in the 19th century as opposed to the ancient period of time. And so he's kind of taken that position. And of course he's a well-known anthropologist who did a lot of work with the Meso stuff in the early 2000s with a Christian apologist firm as well at the time, even and still is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it's always been very fascinating to me just to kind of discuss with all these different things. And I just want to kind of get this sense from you. You said the last thing you held on to was Nahum. That was kind of like, so for you, what was the beginning? What was it that caused your shelf to get heavy in the first place? Was it Christian apologetics? Was it Mormon apologetics? Was it something personal? Just I always like to hear what people's faith journey looks like.
Well, on my first, oh no, this something might be fake, started on my mission.
Okay.
Um, I remember having just, I didn't share this with anybody at the time, but man, I was on the brink of losing my faith in Mormonism, but not Christianity, because I had encountered a pretty good guy that presented some pretty bad stuff about the Book of Abraham and some other things about Joseph Smith. And so I was, but I, at that time, I was still, okay, but I know Jesus is real because evidence demands verdict proved it, because I hadn't bought it and read it yet.
Okay.
And so it was not long. Well, see, my dad, I sent it this, my dad calls it the bombshell letter. I sent him this long letter. Man, I don't know if I believe this. And then my dad overwhelmed me with all this farm stuff and all this other apologetic stuff. And then I was back in. I was
Okay.
concrete. And that's when I went to a Christian bookstore whilst I was there and bought some Josh McDowell, started reading some of that. But yeah, I was far more impressed with the farm stuff.
Okay. So at this time, you're on your mission, you're doing all this research. Did your mission president and your missionary companions have any issues with you going to Christian bookstores and getting books? I mean, sometimes that can be kind of looked down upon on a mission.
Oh, well, I had good companions. There was I did have one that when he noticed all the different books I had, he uh, asked me if I would send them home, and I said no. And that was I put them away so he wouldn't see them anymore. Um, and they're mostly apologetic type books. And but most companion, I mean, I didn't apologize to my mission president if he watches. I didn't keep the rules that well with lots of stuff. Nothing super bad, but yeah, I would if I had a Christian bookstore in my area, I frequented it.
Okay.
And
Okay. And where did you serve your mission at?
Roseville, California, it's just north of Sacramento. Roseville's just north, and went from Roseville all the way up to Redding, which I think is where Scott Gordon lives. But
Okay. So you're saying that so your dad sends you the farm stuff, you're back in it like, okay, this is true.
oh yeah, I was concrete back in.
Okay, so what did it for you?
What got me concreted back?
Oh no, no,
Oh, or what?
what
Oh,
caused? Yeah, did you start
oh,
having
okay. So after I got home, there were little things, a lot of things that I kind of shook me. I reconciled. When I find out Joseph Smith was marrying other men's wives, that bothered me because I had just got out of a relationship where I was really hardcore about making sure I kept, the chastity and all that. And so I was a little bit taken back by that, but I reconciled that, and that has nothing to do with me leaving in the end.
hmm hmm
Um, but that shook me a bit. But it really what it was I started seeing like at Sunstone, Dan Vogel would respond to farms, and I didn't think anyone had been responding to him. They were winning the battle. And I started finding out, no, people really are.
Mhm.
picking apart some of what they're saying. And so some really started crumbling. Chiasmus crumbled for me. Hebraisms crumbled for me. Um, and so Nahum, it came down to Nahum. And I already knew, and here's kind of the thing that sometimes works. A lot of Mormon apologetics, when you're defending the faith against a Christian, you use Bible problems to defend. And so you're already familiar with all those problems. And so once the Mormon problems start to crumble, well, it all is starting to fall. So really, so you could say the Mormon apologetics of turning the argument back had a lot to do with, what once Mormonism fell for me, I already knew Christianity was messed up.
Yes, and I think that's why a lot of people who end up leaving Mormonism, there's a variety of reasons, but one of those factors would be kind of questioning the historicity of maybe some stuff in the Bible or questioning some stuff in Christianity, and that it can then, if you planted those seeds of doubt in conventional Christianity, and then you start having doubts in the Restoration, I can see why one would just say none of it's true.
Yeah, and there was a lot of so I was a theistic evolutionist. I believed evolution. Um, and then there was just all these things that I had to really jump through hoops to reconcile. And kind of in the end, I started thinking, man, do I even believe in Mormonism? Because I've had to come up with all these wild answers to explain things away, and kind of thought, boy, I'm far away from the core. And yeah, eventually just all crumbled. And
And then just had your name removed your name.
well, that was years later.
Yeah.
So I basically lost belief in 2003, but I kept it pretty quiet. And I was
Okay.
still active. I was active for years after that.
Okay. And it's interesting because there's a lot of people like you that I talk to all the time that are kind of in the same boat. I think more and more people, I tell people said 20, 25 years ago, Latter-day Saints most Latter-day Saints didn't know a single person that left the church. Now, 25 years later, every Latter-day Saint knows somebody that's left the church. So there's been this shift that's happened in that world that's been pretty dramatic over the course of the last 20, 25 years. And you've been part of that shift that's going on. Again, this is not an anti-Mormon program. We all know that, but I do like to hear different perspectives and different journeys. And I think I also why I wanted you to come on was because we have this interesting convergence of you engaging the evangelical world, partly because your dad and his evangelical background, and Josh McDowell. Why don't you tell us a little bit? Why don't you actually get your slide presentation ready? And we'll just kind of go through it, just kind of do like a Cliff Notes version of what you did at Sunstone. But while you're getting this ready, getting the slide presentation ready, I just want to remind you this Josh McDowell has been a very important voice within the evangelical world and was one of the more popular Christian apologists out there. Was a best-selling author, was on tons of different TV programs, had his own TV program, uh, was on the speaking circuit and spoke at evangelical conferences and things throughout the country and also throughout the world. So he's a very powerful, very influential person. His son actually is kind of taken the mantle and is actually probably doing better apologetics, excuse me, than his father has. But Ryan, why don't you just tell us a little bit about Josh McDowell and your engagement with him? And
Okay, so this is what when his new version of Evidence that Demands Verdict came out in 2017,
okay,
I initially just got the Audible and started listening to it, and I just started going through a lot of the stuff. I'm like, boy, this is not like what he wrote originally.
right,
And of course, in the new one was co-authored. So see,
that's
that's a
the first.
very early edition there, and it's not the first, but and then so see these are so I that piqued my interest. So I started kind of topically going through several of the different versions from, you know, one of the first ones back in 72, and then his follow up, and then when he put them down to new volumes, and then the new evidence that demands a verdict that you were showing, and then the newest one.
Okay.
And so that's what I started doing. And there's his son, Sean McDowell. And the thing about the new one is it's a lot better. It's not necessarily more convincing, but it's more honest. It really engages with the issues that have come up and admits that they're there. So I can give a few examples here. Now, a lot of his book is him quoting other scholars. That's a lot of what it is. So, he quotes this Nelson Glueck, hope I'm saying that right. This, no discoveries have ever contradicted the Old Testament. And William Albright. A lot of his early editions were based on William Albright, who has really started, well, a big influence on biblical archaeology that set out to prove the Bible.
Mhm.
And so from 1972 to 1999, say talking about the patriarchs, he has all these quotes about how the patriarchal stories now warrant respect and that there's scarcely a single biblical historian that don't believe these patriarchal stories are real and have substantial historicity behind them. And Josh McDowell himself says the one thing that's certain about Abraham is that he was an individual and that he did exist. And he also used Henry Morris, who said nothing contradicts the patriarchal period.
Yeah, and I think that's important because that was one of the key things. Henry Morris is a well-known young Earth creationist, and
Yeah.
when I came across this the 1999 edition, it was when he started quoting from young Earth creationists as sources. I realized, oh my goodness, we've got a problem here because no trained scientist is going to look at this as being anything close to being scientific evidence that proves the Bible.
Right. And the new edition is still young creations, but man, they dropped Morris. There's no Morris quoted in the newest edition.
Okay, see, I think they recognize the
Yeah.
weakness.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And so in the 2017, they actually admit that current Old Testament scholars say that the stories around the patriarchs found in Genesis do not reflect accurate history, and that while Christians still believe that he was, historical, mainline archaeologists and scholars do not.
So let me
And
just read.
that's the admission he would. Before it was, oh man, this is concrete. Whereas now they're saying, okay,
Yeah. I think
now mainstream doesn't believe it. I mean, we still do, but mainstream doesn't. That's something you wouldn't have seen in the earlier editions.
yes, that's and there was a level of confidence in these volumes about these statements that they were making.
Yeah.
And I want to read the second one real quick for the audience. Christians in general believe in the historicity of Abraham. Currently, however, conservative scholars who conclude that the Bible records accurate history are in the minority. While evangelical scholars are now a small minority in the archaeological community, their views regarding the historicity of the patriarchs were once considered mainstream. Okay, so it was interestingly enough, it was kind of like Bible believing people that started biblical archaeology in the 19th century, but as they got professionalized and everything like that, and became more scientific, we see now that this is no longer a position that's considered mainstream, and that many people don't consider the patriarchs to be real people, in many cases. So that's a major concession that they're making. And then as a young person reading this book, perhaps I would have had more credibility if I had read something like that as opposed to the stuff I was reading in the 1999 edition.
Yeah, well, I think for a younger person reading this new version, it would have, credibility. I think for someone that had grown up with the it's concrete. See, I don't know. I don't know what he would say about this new version with all these admissions.
Hmm.
He hasn't read it, um, but I think it could hurt if you had, if you thought all this stuff was concrete, and then you read this new version of Evidence of the Demands of Earth, where it says, well, we still believe it, and these are the reasons why, but it's not concrete.
Yeah. I think that's a really
And
important point you're
so
making.
he turns to a lot of plausibility arguments, which is what Book of Mormon apologists do a lot.
Yes, that's the
And
point. Like there's the plausibility that Abraham existed. Now you're making similar. Yes, I agree with that. And yeah, continue. This is fascinating.
yeah, and so in the new version, they tackle anachronisms in the patriarchal stories, trying to explain them away, where early editions didn't really admit there was any. Other than 1999, the version did mention the Philistines. The Philistines didn't exist till 1200 BC, yet they're mentioned in Abraham and in the stories of Moses. Um, but in this, it's a little more forthright with and a little more detailed on these are the issues and these are the possible solutions to get past them. And as I was saying, the Henry Morris has been dropped.
Yep.
Um, so and yeah, and there's Henry. There he is.
Yep. There's my guy. So that, and just go back real quick to that previous slide. So it was that particular book, The Genesis Flood, that was footnoted in this book that caused me to say, "Oh no, we've got a problem here." Because once I realized this because Josh made a comment, there's scientific evidence that proves the Bible be true, and I thought, well, let me look at that footnote, and that footnote was the Genesis flood, and that was really the
Well,
beginning.
and one thing that I've been doing these presentations at Sunstone 2018 to about 2021. Well, and then again, this last year, on evangelicals and why I think they're having a problem converting Mormons. Uh, I've never addressed Genesis 1 through chapters 1 through 11, like the Genesis flood, evolution, that because if you still believe this stuff, if is literal, not that it's spiritually uplifting, but that it's literal. I'm not sure what I can present, if you actually, if you're still in denial about evolution, that the world was completely flooded. I don't know. I don't know if that merits addressing.
Well,
So,
it's kind of like dealing with a flat earther on some levels, you know. So
yeah.
you just
Oh, it is.
yeah, and so at that point you just don't engage because it's fruitless in many ways. And what I don't understand is why aren't young Earth creationists flat earthers as well? I mean,
Yeah. Oh, and they hate when you do that parallel, though. Young
oh, I
Earth
know they
creation.
hate it, but it's
They
like
hate it. But
but it's in
but
my mind it's I'm just like, well, how, I'm look, and the reason why I say this is I know the guy who came up with the common man's Bible or whatever, who is a Bible commentary, the pastor of First Baptist Church in Lowell, Indiana, who came up with the Flat Earth Bible. And I remember reading the commentary after Genesis 1:1. It says this proves conclusively that evolution is false and that the earth is flat. These verses. I mean, it's in a commentary put out by a fundamentalist Christian. They can't get, and by the way, this is the other thing we need to point out, the stuff that Henry Morris and these young earth creationists are teaching are not historical Christianity. This is based out of 19th century Seventh day Adventism with the visions of Ellen White. And it was George McCready Price in the 1920s, who was a Seventh day Adventist geologist who basically laid the foundation and the framework for young earth creationism. So this is a 19th century religion that many Christians consider to be a cult that gave us young earth creationism. I think it's, and maybe you even talk about this in your thing, but I think it's important to give the context there too.
yeah. No, that's good. I don't talk about that, so I'm glad you
Okay,
brought it up.
good. I wanted to make sure that goes in there. All
All
right.
right, now and this slides from this past year. Yeah, I say that a lot of Christian apologists who are still, things have to be literal. I just say they're in a state of denial, that they have to have it real. So these are just some quotes from different people about the patriarchs. And some of them, like I don't know how to say the tough guy's name, Mazar. He's a devout Jew, but he said, patriarchal stories are not historically valid. And then Juan Pierre Isbouts, he's a devout Christian, and he too says, that scholars can argue over that, but what he's worried about is the spiritual truth in it.
Yes, and so let me
And
read a
I,
couple of these quotes here for the audience. William Deaver, who was actually an evangelical Christian, and basically got into biblical archaeology to prove the Bible, and this is what he says: all respectable archaeologists who have given up hope of recovering any context that would make Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob as historical figures. And that's from his book, What Did the Bible Writers Know? And then this other, Juan Pierre Isbot says, scholars may debate the fact that Abraham and the patriarchs were probably literary constructs, but that doesn't take away the great moral truth of their stories. So this sounds very similar to people that kind of take a position with the Book of Mormon, where these don't necessarily have to be historical events, but they can be some get some truth out of it. And here you're having Christians saying the same thing about the patriarchs and the
yeah, I think that's the direction that it's going to eventually mostly go, um, which is fine. I think it's good. And then, okay, so for the Exodus, the early versions didn't really talk about it much. The 1999 one did, and there's did it happen in the 13th century? Did it happen in the 15th century? Conservative scholars insist the 15th century, and in the 1999 edition, they mentioned that the 13th century is widely accepted, but that it shouldn't need to, but it doesn't need to be accepted. And they kind of go over reasons why it has to be that early one. And, they talk about the city of Ramses, how to reinterpret that. And I joined the Exodus and the conquest here. Um, So, in the early versions, the walls of Jericho were used as evidence, and that there's a lot of evidence for the conquest. The Armana letters written in Egypt describe the the Hebrews takeover of Canaan, so they thought, and he used the Armana letters also using William Albright that had Hebrew origins, the Habiru.
mm.
Uh, where it was connected to the Hebrews. And so it was thought for a while that this was the conquest, and that's how it was presented. Well, in the new edition, they admit that contemporary scholarship and archaeologists doubt or completely disbelieve the Exodus story. James K. Hoffmeyer, he's probably written probably the best defense of the Exodus. I mean, it's not convincing to me, but he does admit that it's an issue, that finding actual support for it is a problem.
Yeah,
And
let me read
then,
what the authors. So this is the authors, the McDowells.
yeah, the McDowells.
As ends as at the outset, we must say the extra biblical evidence for the Exodus is far from overwhelming. We have no smoking gun providing clear, solid evidence that Israel lived in Egypt and that Moses led the Hebrews out of that country. And I go to people, I say, listen, I said, when we're dealing with the archaeological issues of the Book of Mormon, I say, listen, if we propose to have millions of people roaming the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, all we need to do is find one dump that doesn't have any pig bones in it, that would be for me a smoking gun that there was an exodus. We don't even
Right.
have that.
You're right. And again, what fascinated me so much about this is that the McDowells are admitting this, whereas, those early editions of evidence that demands a verdict would have, I mean, everything's concrete.
Right.
And that's really what fascinated me when I first read the book. And so now they center arguments around, plausibility, which is again what Mormon apologists do a lot.
Right.
Uh, they're not as the new one isn't doesn't insist that it has to be that early date. Now well, it could be both. Here's the strengths and weaknesses of both. They're taking a big step back and having lots of concessions on the Exodus. And they also are upfront about the conquest that
Now, I just want to make it very clear, folks, that if this book came out in 1972 as opposed to 2017, Josh McDowell would have been hounded and thrown out of. He would have been considered a progressive, liberal threat to Orthodox
Oh
Christianity,
yeah.
and would not, and his books would not have been sold in Christian bookstores.
Yeah, you see, really, you see, what happens in Mormonism doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
You know what people say, the people, the September 6th wouldn't be excommunicated today, and that's probably true. And this is true too, what you were saying. If this was published back in the 70s, yeah, no one would have liked it.
Even probably even in the 90s when this is
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, even the 90s.
I had Brent Metcalf on a couple of years ago, and I said the funny thing, Brent, is that if you were doing today what you were doing in the 1990s, you would be heralded as a top flight Mormon scholar, as opposed to somebody who was excommunicated in the 90s.
Right.
Exactly the same thing.
So see, now they they say that, the book of Joshua, it's not like a modern history book, it's there for preaching, which again parallels a lot of what Mormon apologists say, so they're taking these steps back. And so they sort of try to make the conquest smaller by, there was only certain cities burned, and uh, they're very honest that the conquest can't fully explain Israelite origins. They, come up with some other reasons. Erosion might have got rid of some of the evidence. They come up, the city of Ai, is a big problem for uh, for biblical archaeologists, and they think it may have been mis misidentified where they think I is. But of course, they think that because it doesn't fit what they need it to.
Right.
And the Hobbyru, they totally dropped that. And I don't even know why he had it in the 99 book. It's been well known for a long time. The Hobbyru really were not the Israelites.
Okay.
So I'm glad that he's caught up.
Good.
And then here's just some general um, stuff about the Exodus and the conquest. And a lot of the stuff comes from, good Christian sources, and they're just being upfront that there's issues. Randall Price wrote a apologetic book, The Stones Cry Out, and he says establishing the history of the Exodus is one of the major problems remaining to biblical scholars. So, they're starting to be a little more upfront.
And I think this is important, Ryan, because a lot of people who use Christian apologists like these books, they claim that they have the evidence that conclusively proves that the Bible is true. And now you have this this but when entering into the realm of science, now that the evidence is out there, we find that entering into this realm, claiming that you have as scientific evidence that proves the Bible to be true, puts you then in the realm of you've got to be able to prove it scientifically.
Right.
Now, many people who have attempted to do this and maybe at one time did believe that the Bible was scientifically proven to be true have now since stepped back from that position. So I think I'm trying to do a public service to evangelicals who are using Christian apologetics arguments that you really need to get caught up here, because you're going to have circles run around you if you're still quoting stuff from the 70s and 80s.
Right. And then here's, I mean, I don't really want to read all these, but
Right.
it's just, some of these people are very devout, both Jew and Christian, that are upfront about some of the issues. And Titus Kennedy. He was on Sean McDowell's show, and then this is what he said. Today, the vast majority of scholars in many different fields would view the Exodus as mythical, and so they are saying it basically never happened. Now, he argues that that it did happen, but he did say that up front, that the majority do say this. And then he wrote that book. He's got a new book out about it. Well, it's a couple of years old now, but
Called Unearthing the Bible. Okay.
yeah.
Hmm.
And then here, there's just a couple quotes from different scholars that the early attempts to prove the Bible archaeologically backfired and didn't work. course, these guys would be considered liberal scholars, so I mean, apologists wouldn't take them seriously anyway. So early editions, the more evidence that demands a verdict was very staunch that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible.
Mhm.
And that's what a lot of that book was devoted to, and which later became volume two of evidence that demands a verdict. But it didn't, the, it only about the only thing it really thought that he wrote Deuteronomy, and maybe there were some editorial things going on. I know that was in the 1999 edition. There might have been some editorial issues, that records Moses' death and that, but he argued hard that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy. And in the new one, they're not quite as staunch on it. The new one, they use plausibility arguments that Moses still could have been the author, and they still think that accounts for the most of the data. Um, oh yeah, and they used to call people that believed in the documentary hypothesis or other versions of it because Europe they're kind of dominated by a different idea, but they call them radical and all that. And they dropped all that. They admit that this is basically the accepted view.
Mhm.
But then they go into that even if there were multiple sources, that don't mean the spiritual value or the religious value is not there, and that it can still be inerrant and have the same authority. So, the arguments changed a lot. Whereas before it was vehemently Moses did this.
Right.
Now it's, well, we still kind of think he did, but if he didn't, here's all these
Mhm.
reasons why that's okay. And this is just a little more about how they argue that that they admit they didn't exist. The Pentateuch didn't exist in its final form until the sixth century, but that the books that and the books came relatively late. This would not necessarily undermine the authority or inerrancy. So their approach is just a lot different, and they also admit that most people think Deuteronomy was post-exilic. They're not as concrete. Moses had to have wrote this. And so it's just fascinating the concessions between this version and all previous ones.
And I want to encourage people while you're watching this, please press pause and just read some of these quotes. We're not reading them all, but I think it's important to get the context here because, again, in one sense, it appears to me that you've got the early editions of the book now they're arguing with each other in one sense too. They're making changes, but the early 70s version and even the 90s version of this book would probably consider this 2017, the arguments made in the 2017 edition, as being threats to their arguments. And so it's just so fascinating to see them shifting so much on so much of this stuff. And again, maybe if this was the edition they came out with in 1999, maybe my shelf wouldn't have gotten so heavy.
Right. And again, they use these scholars, Block and Averback, to say, that even though Deuteronomy was probably written anonymously, it can still be called a book of Moses, because it fits into that genre. And so, it's just a totally different approach
Yeah.
to the entire enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I hope that you're all reading this, giving you red flags here, or not red flags, but maybe really making you think about some of the criticisms that people make about Mormonism in the Book of Mormon.
Right. And so Isaiah, the early editions didn't really address this, but and this is a pretty long quote, but uh, they they are open to the fact that Isaiah may have been written by multiple authors, that there could be the three Isaiahs, and but that it's still a unified whole, still divine, still
Okay.
scripture.
So they admit that there was more than one Isaiah, but it still can be considered
Well,
scripture.
well, they still say that you can still argue that
Oh,
they kind of it's kind of speaking out both sides of their
yeah.
mouth, kind of like, well, the Book of Abraham, well, the scrolls might have been lost, but also might have just been a catalyst. You kind of
Catalyst,
got
exactly.
you
Yeah.
got double things. So they're saying you can still argue that it's just one Isaiah, But even if it wasn't, it's still okay.
Okay, well then let's have at it then. Let's be gracious enough to Mormon scholars that are making the same arguments about their
Oh,
scripture.
oh, oh, yeah, they wouldn't grant any of this to
Oh
Mormon
no.
scholars. Yeah, they wouldn't be. And that's kind of, I guess, my why I've been doing a lot of this is these people trying to minister to Mormons, they need to be a little more, they need to be a little more humble. I mean, yeah, you can see through kind of the issues with some of the Mormon apologetics, but they can't see it with their own,
Mhm.
even though some of it's almost identical.
Yes.
And
So the
so,
parallels are remarkable.
right, they are. And in the section of the New Testament's not as different as dealing with the Old Testament. Well, archaeology is not quite as big of a thing with the New Testament, but some of the 98%
Right.
accuracy of the manuscripts, that was always such an arbitrary claim, and that's been dropped.
That was even dropped in the 99 edition. So just so you know, people, when you hear quotes like 98 or 99% of the manuscripts and blah blah blah, these are no longer arguments that even Josh was making in the 90s.
Right. Yeah, that um and so they still make the claim that the Old Testament prophesied of Jesus, and uh you know the that it's just statistically impossible that he wasn't the Messiah by fulfilling all these. But they admit that it is true that the authors of the New Testament applied some texts for the Old Testament to the Messiah when, in their original context, those texts do not directly apply to the Messiah, and that they may have had multi-layered meanings.
Yep.
Um, so Isaiah 7:14, they're up front that the prophecy really did take place in the lifetime of Ahaz, the fulfillment, but it might have dual application. And I can tell, yeah, this again would not have been in the early editions. I mean, that Isaiah 7:14 is about Jesus. And they apply that to Hosea 11:1, that Matthew applies it, to that out of Egypt I will call my son. Matthew applies it to Jesus, but in its original context, it really was about Israel's escape. And so just little things that they were more upfront about. And here's again, this was from this past summer, just this is John Barton. He says, most scholars agree that New Testament writers kind of manipulated the Old Testament and these prophecies in kind of forcing application to Jesus. And so there's a couple quotes there on that. And I mean, I got a lot of these because I went over this a lot in this past summer, so I don't really want to read it all. But I mean, some of it's from very friendly, the Catholic Study Bible. These are Catholic scholars, and they're very upfront about some of the issues with Isaiah 53 being applied to Jesus, and the altar says it's yeah, that provided a theological template for interpreting the death of Jesus, but no serious scholar thinks it was actually a prediction of it. And then there's some more about Isaiah 7:14. And again, a lot of it's from very faithful Christian scholars. So the use of Flavius Josephus, 1972 to 1979, he uses the full quote. And I assume most of your readers, well, this is what Josephus said. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, that those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. So in those early editions, he uses this quote without any concession that this was an outside source. But then, most scholars do think it was manipulated and added to, and they think some of this was said by Josephus, but not a lot of the more fantastic portions of it. And he says that in He Walked Among Us, which is a 1988 book, and then says that in the 1999 and 2017 versions of the book. And this comes from More Than a Carpenter. This isn't actually an Evans Demands work, but I thought it was worth noting. He has all what happened to all the 12 apostles, and this is, hey, they died. They died for what they believe, which some of them did. Um, but Sean McDowell, this was his doctoral dissertation that he later published, where it's not as concrete.
Yeah, because basically, just so people understand, a lot of these martyrdom stories about the apostles were through just tradition, often Catholic tradition, and so there isn't a whole lot of historical evidence that's actually how they died.
Right.
And then Sean McDowell's book okay, now this is the Jesus Seminar. Now this, oh boy, see some interesting folks on that line up there.
Yeah, so the 1999 version devoted a lot of time to the Jesus Seminar. They did they were kind of popular in the
And that was
90s.
kind of a that was big in the 90s, but it's certainly petered out in many ways. You'd have to agree. The Jesus Seminar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was just bringing this up just to show a difference in emphasis. So, he went after a large, had I think a whole chapter in 99 going after Jesus Seminar. Now it's just Bart Ehrman.
Okay. Okay.
He goes after just Bart Ehrman.
Okay.
And in fact, I wanted to mention this earlier. A lot of Christian apologists, they make it seem like, so someone like Bart Ehrman, they focus all this attention on him and make it as though he's the outlier. He's
Right.
the odd guy.
Hmm.
Um, without uh acknowledging that really he's just pretty representative of the general understanding of scholars, which Bart Ehrman says all the time. And with the Old Testament, or with Old Testament archaeology, they do that with Israel Finkelstein.
Hmm.
When I went down to Manti Pageant 2 years in a row and had some discussions with one of the ministries down there. I can't remember. They're based in Ephraim, but I had a discussion with two of them. Both of them, oh, you've been reading Israel Finkelstein, and I was all, well, yeah, I have, but he's not the sole guy talking
Well,
about
just
the Exodus and all that.
real quick, just to explain to the audience, who's Israel
Oh,
Finkelstein?
Israel Finkelstein, yeah, he's a archaeologist based in I believe he's still based out of Jerusalem, and he's written some popular books about the the Exodus, the conquest, and the patriarchs, and a lot of the issues with it. And so what his one book, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was a really popular book, and so it kind of got distributed quite broadly. And so that seems to be the guy apologists like to target and make it sound as though he's out of the norm. And um when really he's pretty, yeah, he's controversial. There's a lot of bad blood between him and William Deaver, who brought up earlier on certain things, but not on things like the Exodus didn't happen the way the Bible says, or that the conquest didn't happen the way the Bible says. they're at each other's throats about. And so I mean, so I mean, every time I had some back and forth correspondence in email with one of those, and oh well, I don't trust Israel Finkelstein, and they got some apocryphal story about how someone over there told them that he was gonna hide something
Oh,
because he didn't want people to find out,
yeah.
and they call him Finky over there, and
Yeah,
so.
there's always that conspiracy theory tone
Yeah,
that happens that they're
and
hiding
so
evidence. Yeah.
ever since then, when I've presented these like this past year when I was doing the one on the Eric Johnson book,
Mhm.
the responding to his book, uh, I didn't use Bart Ehrman or Israel Finkelstein one time
Good.
on purpose
Yeah. Well,
because
you
you
get
don't need every central argument they have, other people make,
right, and
and so I
that's exactly. Other people make it, and then they make it about the person and not about the actual evidence that they're presenting or what they're actually talking about. Just to give a little background, since we have the slide here, Bart D. Ehrman was attended both Wheaton College and Moody Bible Institute. So he's raised in an evangelical world, took the Bible literally growing up, and then basically deconverted, but not because of scholarship. It was actually with the problem of evil that he couldn't really wrap his mind around of, and decided is no longer a believer, but is a top-notch biblical scholar nonetheless. So,
yeah, so yeah, he gets targeted a lot.
yeah, unfortunately. And so does my friend Dan McClellan too. And the same thing.
Yeah, so Catholics. So I use Catholic scholar Raymond Brown a lot because he says a lot of the same things that Bart Ehrman does. He's dead now, but and he was a priest, and so this was part of the presentation. I think Sean McDowell is probably the influence behind
Mhm.
the changes
Yes.
because he actually is a Bible scholar, and if he's gonna pin his name on something, he probably couldn't do it the way the old versions were
Right.
written. And so I do think he is the guy behind why the new evidence, the version of it is, much different, not quite as confident in the arguments he makes. So basically, that is the presentation
Right.
on Josh McDowell.
Let me just read the last four bullet points here. Your conclusion on this: the Christian apologetic classic, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, is an excellent example of how Christian apologetics have had to change due to modern scholarship. Many of these changes due to modern scholarship are similar to how Mormon apologists have been forced to change. Both Christian and Mormon apologetics attempt to defend the traditional beliefs while simultaneously entertaining a faithful approach to non-traditional conclusions. Similar apologetic tactics among Mormons and Protestant Christians creates even more difficulty for evangelical ministries to Mormons to be effective, which is the exact same conclusion that I have come to in my little journey here within the restoration as well. Ryan, why don't you exit out of the share here and let's maybe just wrap up and do a few final thoughts on this as well. First of all, I just wanted to say, folks, this is the first time that I've seen the presentation. I was unable to attend Sunstone when he gave it. And actually, I generally, when I have people on, I don't want to know the presentation ahead of time. I kind of want to learn about it along with the audience. And I thought it was a really fascinating story. I just wanted to share real quick with the audience my kind of encounters. And I haven't really talked about this, and I don't know how much I'm going to talk about it. But basically, I've been on the receiving end of the organization, Mormonism Research Ministry, that Eric Johnson and others are a part of. And just right around my birthday in September, they gave me a nice little birthday present, and it was called On Steve Pynakker, and this is on the MRM.org um, website. And let me just put it this way, folks, I have not heard from anybody about this hit piece they did on me. So it goes to show the extent of influence I have in these spheres because nobody's coming to say, oh my gosh, I came across this. But I did feel it's important. I will respond to this at some point. But Aaron Shalafaloff wrote this thing, never let me vet it ahead of time, never gave me the courtesy of making, any corrections or clarifications. I even found that he had some bad links in there that I was nice enough to tell him about after he released this. But again, they what they did was they basically just took quotes of mine and basically made it sound like well, like the evidence leans towards there not being a God. Well, I'm just being honest in that making that statement. I think creation is not well designed. Well, and again, what is my view on the origin of life or on evolution have anything to do with Mormonism? Half the churches I attend are restorationists, blah blah blah. And then like the evangelical church has to die, and then take something out of context. It's just this is the thing. I feel like Christian apologetics, I'm glad to see, first of all, that some improvements have been made with Josh McDowell's series. That's encouraging. Good scholarship, I commend all the time. That's why I've been in touch with Fair Mormon. I reached out to the president of Mormonism Research Ministry last year, a little over a year ago, and offered to help them. Like says, listen, I will help you guys, help you do better scholarship, encourage them to get involved in the Mormon studies community, and even encourage Bill McKeever, the president, to write a paper. And then the next day they attack me for attending a Bickertonite baptism, which is just insane and not very Christian. And so I kind of feel like part of what I'm doing here is a ministry in the sense that I want people to know that, one, not all evangelicals think the same way. Many of us have issues with a lot of the things that are being taught by these apologetics organizations. They do not speak for all of us, and there are people who have put a lot of thought and time and effort into really trying to get to the bottom of things and not try to try to take evidence to prove our worldview, but to follow the evidence where it leads. And I think that's really important and do better scholarship. And we all benefit. In other words, if Mormon apologists use better scholarship and evangelical apologists use better scholarship, we will have better conversations and better dialogue.
Amen.
So I just wanted to say I really appreciated you doing this. And honestly, we've talked a little bit in the past, and I was really intrigued by this because, again, Josh McDowell is a household name in many evangelical households, and he's been very influential. And many people, if you're going on online discussion boards, wherever, Facebook, Reddit, many of the arguments, even the many of the old arguments that Josh no longer uses, are being used in those forums. And I think it's really important as a public service to people that have decided that they're going to engage in defending their faith. They need to have the best information and the latest scholarship and the latest research. It will not be found in this book, but it will be found in later editions of the series. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to go through this and study it and actually also engage some evangelical apologists as well.
Yeah, man, it's the Sunstone presentation is actually on YouTube.
Oh,
I
okay.
think it was there for about a year before I even knew it was there. So, yeah, if
That's
you Google my name and Josh
well,
McDowell, it'll probably come up.
send me the link and I'll put it in the description um,
Okay.
for the video. And also just I wanted to ask you, you engaged Aaron, of course, the person who wrote that hit piece on me. Actually, it was probably a month later that he published the hit piece that he was engaging with you. Do you feel that overall you've had positive correspondence with like Eric Johnson and Aaron or an engagement with them?
Uh, yes. I mean, I've talked with both of them, long before this past summer. Um, and he, and like I said, I had my first conversation with Aaron probably back around 2007, 2008, and he was pleasant to talk to. And then when I saw him on like the fair discussion board, he was a little bit different there than in person. Maybe a little more aggressive, and I'm like that too. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm guilty of being far more harsh online because no one's there to punch you in the face,
Yeah, yeah. And
And so,
yeah. But
you know,
he
so I mean, I'm probably worse. I'm probably the worst at doing that than anyone. But but yeah, he's like that. He's very confident in what he believes. But he's a pleasant person he really is pleasant to talk to.
That's what I hear. I
Um,
just would love the opportunity to finally have that conversation. One day we will hopefully do it. He spent years avoiding having a conversation with me for whatever reason.
and we had a pleasant correspondence before and after,
That's great.
I don't really have anything bad to say
Good.
about it.
I'm glad.
Eric Johnson, I think a great guy. It's kind of why I contacted him. I felt like I was kind of doing a hit piece on him, so I contacted him, so that he could say something back, and
Well,
I'm
that
not
was
just
nice of you
ripping
to
on
do.
him.
I wish the same
Um,
courtesy was extended to me, but
yeah.
yeah.
And so, and then we kind of had online, well, I guess I don't want to go into politics, but we're more in line there. So
Okay, got it. Got it. Excellent. Well, Ryan, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the program today.
yeah, it was a lot of fun.
It was great. And did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share, or do you feel like you got everything covered?
I think I covered it. I still just think that part of their problem is they won't, like with the Book of Abraham, you got a large majority of scholars think a lot of the writings of Paul are forgeries or, pseudepigrapha, the nicer way to say it.
Mhm.
And so when you just recognize you got some of the same problems, I think it can humble you
Yes.
when you're trying to witness to Mormons. So I mean, I get theologically, they're just that
Yeah.
they don't think they have the right Jesus. So,
Right.
but
And
you got to come up with a different approach.
well, and my good friend John DeLynn, one of the things he told me years ago, he says we all need to exercise epistemological humility. And I really think that is so true. And that's what I try to exercise as well. I've been humbled many times. I've been humbled many times this past year going through what I've been going through. And I think it's really important. Look, I sometimes maybe go in tangents and stuff that I shouldn't, but for the most part, God kind of keeps me in line as best I can and my friends, which I really do greatly appreciate. So, folks, leave in the comments what you think about this presentation. What are your thoughts on the historicity of the Book of Mormon, the historicity of the Bible? Are there similar issues with anachronisms in both? Do you see parallels in how evangelical and Protestant apologists and Latter-day Saint apologists often use some of the same arguments to defend their truth claims? I'm always fascinated by these types of conversations that we can have, as long as it's just most importantly be civil. So I'll links in the description to everything we talked about. Make sure you send me that link to the YouTube video on Sunstone.
I will.
And also, there's links in the description for those of you who like to financially support the channel. Could not do it without you. Greatly appreciate it. Remember, this is the most important thing. All the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.